Well, first of all, when it comes to the cage, the thing is, like, I mean, this was filmed back in 1964. I mean, it really is amazing how well, just as a standalone pilot sort of mini movie, how well the cage actually holds up, Mark.
So, but what was really remarkable was not only how good it looked, but one of the things, because obviously we're all huge Shatner fans,
Huge.
and at times that means sort of dismissing Jeff Hunter. But they say there's a difference between feature film acting and television acting, and the one thing that really resonated for me watching it today was watching Jeff Hunter on the big screen. It was a totally different experience than watching him on TV. It's exactly what they say about acting. He was a feature actor, and it was the most alive I've ever seen him.
He's doing a lot of little stuff that you don't notice on a TV screen.
What did you notice seeing it on the big screen that maybe you didn't pick up on the small screen?
Look, it's the great thing about it is, like we were talking about, those subtle little things that Jeff Hunter is doing because he's a movie actor. But also, it's the different sort of takes on the secondary characters. That, the poor guy who's standing next to the captain's chair in the cage, sort of just standing there not really knowing what to do at all. He hands the captain a report, and the captain doesn't really give a damn about it.
Yeah.
But you can see him in the background in Where No Man Has Gone Before in the rec deck. So it's funny that all these secondary characters, maybe we'll see them sometime in the future in some other TV show maybe, but probably not.
And it's funny because we're here to celebrate Star Trek, but the other thing was I never have disliked Paul Fix as Piper as much as I did today. I didn't realize what a thankless role he had. And, it's funny because we all know that Gene, was used to getting his way, and when he didn't, he could be a little petulant, right? But he wanted Dee Kelly from the beginning, and Bob Butler talked him out of it. And, John Hoyt he's good in the cage. It's not a great, it's not a great role, but he's great in it, and has one of the great scenes in Star Trek, the scene where he's talking to Pike. It was so great they did again the Corbomite maneuver. But Paul Fix in I wouldn't say it's a thankless role. It's just like, it's a glorified
He doesn't have much to do, yeah.
Yeah, he's not very good.
Just come in and be grumpy.
Yeah.
But so much had been written over the years. I mean, it's become like print the legend about how NBC thought that the pilot was too cerebral. How much of that is actually true, Daren?
As we have learned over the years, a lot of these apocryphal stories that Roddenberry himself told weren't exactly as he said. Most of the reaction to number one in the cage was actually a reaction to the fact that she was his girlfriend, and not that there was a negative reaction from the test audiences. But one thing I noticed here, that he says, no one had ever asked for a second pilot before. Not true. The Munsters had a second pilot. Gilligan's Island had a second pilot. It was often done. So, maybe he's talking about never before for an hour-long drama show. But I think he sort of liked to expand that legend a little more.
Well, there's that conventional wisdom we all got from listening to Inside Star Trek as kids, right, on the LP. Yep. Those of us a certain age, too cerebral, and it got ingrained in our heads. Oh, it's too smart for the network, right? But in fact, that's not really the case. They spent, as you talked about at the beginning, a huge amount on it. Desilu had a deficit, which means in addition to what NBC was spending, Desilu had to put in a bunch of money to make the cage, and it went way over budget and way over schedule. So NBC kind of had attitudes like, how are you gonna, if we give you a 26 episode order, how are you going to do this on a weekly basis? And they were somewhat circumspect about it. And one of the big reasons they wanted a second pilot was to prove that they could do it on a TV schedule, because this was a feature schedule.
Yeah, for sure.
And it shows, because the cage really looks great. And this is before Jerry Finnerman, and that's something else. Ernie Haller, who was the DP on Gone with the Wind, did Where No Man Has Gone Before on only a 9-day schedule. Doesn't look nearly as good as the cage. Cage really holds up theatrically. And, the full color version now exists. And I'd love to watch that one day, although it is very interesting to watch the way this was screened for many years, the black and white and color version. Particularly, there are a couple of times where you hear Malachi Throne as the voice of the Telosian, who played Commodore Mendez in The Menagerie, and they don't pitch his voice, so you can really hear that it's him. So it's a very interesting curiosity.
What's your take, Darren, on how the cage got so much right about Star Trek? How so much of what was in the cage is just carried through for Star Trek for decades, and in some of the ways maybe that the cage didn't exactly does not hold up.
Well, I think that it firmly established the sort of adventure exploration portion of Star Trek. It fully took that from basically Forbidden Planet, and it is a direct sequel to Forbidden Planet in that sense. It's interesting, though, that the dynamic that Shatner brings is so much different. That's the difference. I mean, you can see it in watching these two next to each other. The action-adventure lead that Shatner was is so much more interesting, exciting, driving in the story. He is not only an action, fisticuffs hero, but he's also very, he reasons his choices out a lot. And you can see that, beating him up inside.
He wears his emotions on his sleeve. He feels very deeply.
Yeah. Whereas Pike is just sort of very internal, and he's screwed up inside, and he really doesn't know what to do.
We talked about this back in November at the marathon we did in November. I brought this up on Inglorious Treksperts. I said it in one of
From
your...
the first moment you see him on screen.
Yes. Yeah, he's quoting me. He's imitating me, quoting what I said. But I'll say it again, that when you watch Where No Man Has Gone Before, and you see Kirk and Spock in the rec room playing three-dimensional chess, you could see that William Shatner from Act 1, Scene 1, he had Kirk down. He was born to play this guy. So... but he wasn't actually the first choice to play Kirk.
No, there's
after
so many
Jeffrey
interesting people that were on that list. I mean, Lloyd Bridges, who was a drinking buddy of Gene's, who said, "I'm not."
I'm sure he had many.
I'm not. Yeah, he had many, like Bruce Dern. But I don't want to do sci-fi goofy, because sci-fi to that point was mostly goofy crap, right? And
Yeah, it was Captain Video.
Yeah, Captain Video, and even Lost in Space, and it's interesting because Gene did have an elevated sense of sci-fi, and even before he started the pilot, they rewatched one of his favorite movies, Robinson Crusoe on Mars, and they rewatched obviously Forbidden Planet probably a few times. Day the Earth Stood Still, another favorite of Gene Roddenberry's. And then you also had on that original list was like James Coburn and Rex Reason and a lot of big, sort of.
Jack Lord.
Jack Lord, I was going to get to Jack Lord because Jack Lord got pretty serious, but Jack Ward wanted a piece of the show financially, and they were like, no way. So it could have been, he was very lucky because he went on the Hawaii Five-0 and ended up making a fortune, more than he would have ever made on Star Trek.
That's absolutely true. I wanted to talk about, like, when you watch Where No Man Has Gone Before, Leonard Nimoy, even past Where No Man Has Gone Before, it took him a few episodes to before he finally got comfortable with playing Spock. Like, when do you think, Darren, that Nimoy finally said, okay, I got it?
Nimoy said in a couple interviews that it wasn't until he got this note from Joe Sargent on Corbomite Maneuver, where I think his line was fascinating, and Joe Sargent said, don't be surprised by it. Just think to yourself,
insatiable curiosity.
Yeah. And that talking about internalizing emotions, that's what Joe Sargent told him to do, to sort of, not outwardly express this, because, the Vulcanians at that time didn't express emotions outwardly. But he said, Nimoy himself said, that was the moment that he sort of started to piece all this together.
Be a scientist, which was also something Bob Butler said.
Absolutely.
On the pilot. because it was interesting, because I know Leonard talks about once Shatner was there, it gave me something to play.
Like, why was it Shatner? Why Shatner and not Jeff Hunter? What was the difference there?
Jeff Hunter was so subdued and so kind of emotionless that Nimoy couldn't also be emotionless. That's why you get the women, you know, and all that, because he's playing against, that. But you see vestiges of that in Where No Man Has Gone Before, and it isn't until the Corbomite Maneuver, which was the first episode shot, where Joe Sargent gave him that brilliant note, which not only colored Spock for the next 50 years, but
colored every actor to play a Vulcan from then on.
Well, at least the good ones. So it was really remarkable. And I got to give Bob Butler credit, because I think The Cage is actually beautifully directed for TV, although they shot it on like a Game of Thrones schedule. But I mean, even I love that that tracking shot where he storms out of after watching Vina do the Orion Slave Girl dance, or the Orion Fire Spray gunship dance, and comes walking out of back into the cage.
Great. And we follow with him, and then behind us, three burly grips are moving the rock wall in, and then we go over and he's trapped. It's a great cinematic
It's a great shot, and TV directors, especially back then, got the reputation of being traffic cops, and a lot of them were. But Bob Butler was a real artist, and of course he went on to do the Remington Steele pilot. He went on to do Hill Street Blues, which is an incredible pilot. He went on to do Moonlighting. I mean, he's done Lois and Clark. He's done amazing. Midnight Caller, amazing work.
And he went on to be a guest on Inglorious Treksperts.
He did, and if you're interested in hearing Bob Butler, he was a great guest on the podcast, but really does a beautiful job shooting The Cage.
Yeah.
And it's really hard. You're shooting with one camera back then. You're shooting on film. It's really remarkable. And James Goldstone, conversely, I think did a lot less interesting job, but he had a much shorter
I think he was
schedule.
under a lot more pressure, though.
Although he had some interesting shots. There's that high wide in some of the footage that was cut, looking down in the hallway through the grill,
right,
which I thought was really cool. So he did some interesting things, and I'm so glad you showed that original version. The last time I saw that was like at the Museum of Broadcasting back in New York, years and years and decades ago. And it's always so interesting to see that the lost footage of Gary Lockwood leering at the yeoman in the hallway and everything. And that's what you said. What doesn't hold up? Clearly, the casual sexism of the 60s doesn't hold up, but I think it was really interesting, even in the menagerie, how much of the stuff that we would consider problematic in The Cage is not in the menagerie.
Right.
So even then, there was a sense that was, sort of, not the Roddenberryisms needed to be truncated.
Right.
James Goldstone, so he directed Where No Man Has Gone Before. He also directed What a Little Girl's Made Of. The thing I didn't know, I think I read it in your book, is that he was, when John Black, who wrote The Naked Time, stepped down or left in a huff as a producer, he did not get along with Roddenberry. James Goldstone was actually considered to be his replacement, and he passed. So, but it's like when you look at all the producers who came and went in Star Trek,
It was a revolving door, and the Next Gen was even worse. But it's so interesting you mentioned John D.F. Black. John D.F. Black had a lot to do with writing the famous, iconic opening narration. And that's another reason why it's so interesting to see the original pilot of Where No Man Has Gone Before, that opening Shatner. We've been dealing with space law, maybe with Corbin Burnson, I don't know. And now we're going to the end of the galaxy. And, it's a terrible piece of narration. I mean, Bill does as much as he can with it, but it makes you appreciate that brilliant opening narration that eventually was a combination of John D.F. Black and Gene and everybody coming up with something that was really super cool, because that clearly wasn't it.
But it's also fun to see this version because you can definitely see the wagon train to the stars. Mm-hmm. It sounds like a Western. It looks like a Western. They're totally going for that vibe without outwardly saying it.
This episode?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
it's a Gunsmoke episode.
Well, and it's what you've always said about television at the time was always more about the guest star than the lead.
Yep.
And this is as much about Gary Lockwood and Sally Kellerman as it is about Kirk's dilemma, which is why it certainly isn't in my top 10. There are great things about it. There are great scenes.
But it's not really about our crew.
And Gary Lockwood, of course, is basically playing himself. I mean, he had worked for Gene on The Lieutenant, and they had a great relationship. But, he's always had a healthy sense of self, narcissist. And so he said it was very easy to get into that role. The hardest thing about it for both of them were the contact lenses, which were brutal.
So, I've just been thinking a lot about Lucille Ball because of Being the Ricardos, which is it's on Amazon. It's terrific, and Nicole Kidman's nominated. Javier Bardem is nominated, and I think in a week or two there's a documentary about Lucy and Desi to sort of complement that. But I mean, Lucille Ball, like, how the hell did she come to make a pilot like The Cage?
Well, look, here's the thing we give her a lot of credit, and she deserves it. But, there was a point, and this may be apocryphal, that she thought Star Trek was about celebrities on a cruise ship. She wasn't that engaged in the day-to-day at Desilu, right?
The Love Boat.
She did. Now, she is the one who basically, when they said, should we make the second pilot, it's going to cost us a lot of money, she stepped up and said, yes, we need to do this. So she deserves a ton of credit. But, she wasn't like reading scripts and giving notes and, that involved. But ultimately, we have her to thank for Star Trek existing.
But her boldness for making Desilu a vital studio in itself is absolutely laudable.
Yes, absolutely.
But that first of all, she's the first female head of a studio. And it wasn't just Star Trek. It was Mannix. It was Mission Impossible. The Untouchables.
Untouchables, yeah.
So what happened?
It's a tragedy what happened to Desilu.
What happened to Desilu?
Ultimately, they just, it's like now it's very, you have to spend a lot of money, and it's very hard to compete with the studios. And, they were deficiting a lot of money on Mission Impossible and Star Trek, which eventually would have come back to them. But they couldn't keep it up, so they had to sell to Paramount. And, eventually the risk was rewarded, but not to Desilu, not to Lucy, but to Paramount. Paramount basically inherited it. And all Paramount did at the time was, cut the budget.
Cut the budget and kill them.
So.
I never noticed this before until recently. So at the end of The Trouble with Tribbles, when you see that final thing during the credits, with Baylock, it says a Desilu production. And then the next episode that they filmed, was Bread and Circuses. And that was the transition episode from Desilu to Paramount, also from Gene Kuhn to John Lucas, but also it says a Paramount production.
Yeah.
But when you would think, and certainly they, meaning like Bob Justman and Roddenberry, thought that, Paramount's a big studio, we're going to have an embarrassment of riches now with which to produce a show. That's not what happened.
No, basically, Paramount inherited Star Trek, which was sort of soft in the ratings. Yeah. At least the way they measured ratings then, and it was costing them a ton of money, and honestly, you couldn't imagine it going much further at that pace, and that's the reason that Desilu sold. So I think it's and let's be honest, at that point Paramount was more focused on their motion pictures. Absolutely. And they were just getting into their sort of golden age of motion picture production in the late 60s and early 70s. So they weren't really concerned with the television aspect, besides Brady Bunch. But I think it's amazing, certainly, that Star Trek made it out of that mess, and through the magic of syndication, gained a new second wind.
Because in the late 70s, with things like Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley, Mork and Mindy, the Paramount really starts to have success with television. It's really interesting because, even NBC had come back after success in syndication and wanted to pick up Star Trek again for new episodes, but they wanted a new pilot. And Paramount's like, well, you got 79 pilots already. We're not going to spend the money to do a pilot. And so a new Star Trek series didn't happen.
But thank goodness they didn't.
Thank God.
Well, but this was even before Phase 2.
I know.
Yeah, and then Phase 2, it doesn't happen, which is another aborted Star Trek series in the mid-70s. I mean, the history of Star Trek is, to steal a phrase, fascinating. I mean, it's just really amazing. And that's what's so interesting about these two pilots, too. It's just such an amazing thing. There's so many points in the history of Star Trek where it looked like it was over. And it never is. It looked like it was over after The Cage. It looked like it was over, it could have been after We're No Man, after Turnabout Intruder for sure.
After the first season.
The second season.
After Private Little War,
Motion
it could have been
picture.
done.
I mean, after Phase 2 was canceled, after Motion Picture. I mean, it just goes on and on. That's why it's amazing. Here we are 55 years later, and Star Trek's still around in
You
some
can't
form.
kill the thing.
As much as some people have tried.
The thing that's interesting is, and you mentioned syndication, is the three of us are part of the syndication generation. And Daren, you discovered Star Trek through the animated series.
Well, first, yes, but I soon after.
Soon
picked
after.
Up the,
So, when you watch, and Where No Man Has Gone Before isn't just a really great pilot that finally sold the show. It's one of the best episodes of the series. I mean, I remember when Where No Man Has Gone Before. I think I love Where No Man Has Gone Before. I could watch.
You weren't
that,
watching. You
That
were
is on
off
my
interviewing
constant
Jessica
rotation. I always go back to that episode to watch it. Whereas certain episodes I definitely don't, like The Way to Eden. But it was really special to have this thing that looked like it was definitely done, and then people discovered it in syndication, and that led to everything else that we have now. Yeah. So
I'm still mourning Kelso. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Why isn't there a Star Trek Kelso TV show?
Poor Kelsey was the first one to die, or the first one filmed.
He wasn't even wearing a red shirt. He was wearing a yellow velour mustard.
No, there's
turtleneck.
the great 9 unnamed deaths that happened in the barrier breach.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, so Mark and Daren host Inglorious Treksperts. It is if you're sitting in this room and you're not listening to Inglorious Treksperts, the podcast, which you can find anywhere, you're missing out. So please check it out, and please make sure you stick around for the rest of the day.
And Enterprise Instance is Scott's podcast, which is wonderful, and you should check that out.
Thank you very much.
And I'm sure you all have podcasts, but we don't have time.
And coming soon, the 4K version of the director's cut.
The director's edition.
The director's edition.
It's not a director's cut. It's a director's edition.
The director's edition of Star Trek the Motion Picture.
She'll launch on time and she'll be ready?
I guess so, sir.
Well, Daren, Mark, thanks so much
Thank
for
you,
being
Scott.
here.
This
For
was
the
great.
second
Thank you,
time.
Skirball.